James Miller pulled his worn jacket tighter around his shoulders as the early morning wind cut through the streets of downtown Dallas. The cold seemed to find every hole in his clothing, a harsh reminder of how far he had fallen. 10 years ago, he had stood tall in his Marine uniform, respected and proud. Now at 43, he was just another face that people looked past on the street. The sun was barely up, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Most people were rushing to work, coffee cups in hand, eyes fixed forward or down at their phones. None of them noticed James as he made his way slowly down the sidewalk. That was usually how he preferred it. Being invisible meant being safe. It hadn't always been this way. There was a time when James had a home, a wife named Becky, and even plans for kids someday. 3 tours in Afghanistan had changed all that. He came back with medals and nightmares. The medals went into a drawer, the nightmares stayed. "You're not the same man I married," Becky had told him before she left. Maybe she was right. The James who went to war died somewhere in those dusty mountains. Someone else came home in his place. James felt his stomach twist with hunger as he passed a small bakery. He couldn't remember the last time he'd eaten a proper meal. The shelter had been full last night, so he'd slept under the highway overpass. No dinner, no breakfast. The small sign on the bakery door read, "Martinez's Bakery, fresh bread daily," and the smell coming through the door when customers entered was like torture. He stopped across the street watching people go in and out. Each person emerged with paper bags full of warm bread and pastries. An old lady came out with what looked like a loaf of sourdough. A businessman grabbed something quick, probably a muffin or bagel. A mother with 2 small children left with a box that might have held a cake or cookies. James touched the dog tags that still hung around his neck. Sometimes when things got really bad, he would hold them tight and try to remember who he used to be. Sergeant James Miller, the guy who saved his whole squad when they got pinned down outside Kandahar. The guy who got letters from home every week. The guy with a future. His feet carried him across the street before he really decided to move. He told himself he was just going to look, maybe feel the warmth from inside for a minute. The bell jingled as he pushed open the door. The girl behind the counter looked up, her smile fading slightly when she saw him. James was used to that reaction. His beard was long and untrimmed, his clothes dirty despite his best efforts to keep clean using public bathroom sinks. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice polite but cautious. "Just looking," James mumbled, breathing in the wonderful smell of fresh bread. The shop was small but warm. Shelves lined with loaves of all shapes and sizes covered one wall. A glass case displayed fancy pastries and cookies. James felt out of place, like a shadow that had wandered into the light by mistake. A man emerged from the back room, flour, dusting his apron. He looked at James with narrowed eyes. This must be Martinez himself. "You buy something or you leave," the baker said firmly. "This is not a warming station." James nodded and turned to go. As he reached for the door, his gaze fell on a basket near the counter. It held day-old bread marked down to half price. His stomach cramped painfully. What happened next would be told differently depending on who was asked. James would later say he only reached for a half loaf that had fallen beside the dumpster out back. The baker would insist James had slipped several rolls into his coat pockets from the day-old basket. Either way, by the time James made it to the alley behind the shop, Martinez was following him, shouting about thieves and vagrants. "I wasn't stealing," James tried to explain, his hands shaking. "I was just looking for what you were throwing away." But the baker had already pulled out his phone and called the police. Within minutes, a patrol car pulled up at the end of the alley. 2 officers approached cautiously, hands resting near their weapons. "Let me see your hands," the first officer called out. James raised his hand slowly, feeling a familiar sense of defeat wash over him. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said quietly. "I was just hungry." The officers patted him down, finding 2 bread rolls in his pocket. James couldn't remember putting them there. Maybe he had. Maybe hunger had made him careless or desperate. "You can't just take things because you need them," the younger officer said as he put handcuffs on James. "That's not how it works." James felt a spark of anger for the first time in months. "I serve my country," he said, his voice stronger. "Now. I gave everything. And this is what I get? Arrested for bread when I'm starving? The officers exchanged uncomfortable glances but continued with the arrest. As they walked him to the patrol car, the older officer noticed something. You, military? He asked, pointing to the chain around James's neck. James nodded. Marines. 3 tours in Afghanistan. The officer's face softened slightly, but he still opened the back door of the patrol car. Sorry, buddy. Law's the law. As they drove away, James caught a glimpse of himself in the reflection of the window. Hollow eyes stared back at him from a face weathered by sun and hardship. He barely recognized himself anymore. In the police station, they took his fingerprints and emptied his pockets. His few possessions were placed in a plastic bag: a tattered veteran's ID card, 83 cents in change, a small notebook with Becky's address scribbled inside, though he'd never used it, and his dog tags. One phone call, the desk sergeant told him, pointing to a wall-mounted phone. James stared at it blankly. Who would he call? His parents were both gone. Becky had made it clear she'd moved on. Most of his Marine buddies were either dead, still overseas, or fighting their own battles. With civilian life, no one to call, he finally said. As they led him to a holding cell, James wondered how this would end. Probably with some community service, maybe a few days in jail. Either way, he'd still be hungry, still be homeless, still be a stranger in the country he'd once been willing to die for. For 3 days, James slept on a thin mattress in the county jail. The cell was small but clean, and the food, while bland, was regular. Some of the guys he met inside told him to look on the bright side. At least he had a roof over his head and 3 meals a day. But James couldn't shake the feeling that something had gone terribly wrong with his life. How had he gone from being a decorated Marine to being locked up for stealing bread? The morning of his court appearance, a guard brought him a set of clean clothes. Not his own clothes, which were still dirty, but a donated pair of pants and a button-up shirt that was a size too big. The pants were held up by a belt with no metal buckle. You clean up nice, the guard said, not unkindly. Make sure you call the judge Your Honor and keep your answers short. James was led through a series of hallways and into a holding room with about a dozen other men waiting for their turn before the judge. Some looked nervous, tapping their feet or biting their nails. Others seemed bored, like they'd been through this many times before. A few were sleeping, heads tilted back against the wall. A young man in a wrinkled suit came into the room carrying a stack of folders. He looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes and coffee stains on his tie. This was Thomas, the court-appointed attorney assigned to James's case. Miller? Thomas called out, checking his watch. James raised his hand. That's me. They moved to a corner of the room where Thomas flipped open a folder. Petty theft and trespassing. First time for theft, but I see you've got some vagrancy citations. He glanced up at James. Military? Marines, James said. 3 tours in Afghanistan. Thomas nodded, but James couldn't tell if the information meant anything to him. Look, with your record, you'll probably get 30 days. Judge Harriet Wilson is fair, but she's strict. My advice? Plead guilty, show remorse, and we can wrap this up quickly. He didn't look James in the eye while he spoke, already flipping through another folder. 30 days? James asked. I just took some bread because I was hungry. Thomas sighed. Look, I get it, but the system doesn't care why you did it. Martinez is pressing charges, and that's that. He checked his watch again. We're up in 10 minutes. Any questions? James had 1,000 questions, but he could see that Thomas was already mentally moving on to his next case. What happens to my spot at the shelter? He asked finally. I've been on the waiting list for months. I'm almost at the top. Thomas shrugged. You'll have to start over, probably, but hey, you'll have a roof for 30 days at least. With that, he moved on to the next name on his list, leaving James to think about what 30 days in jail would mean. Not just losing his spot at the shelter, but losing the small routines he'd built. The library where the kind librarian let him read books and use the computer. The community center that offered free showers on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The weekly VA support group he'd finally worked up the courage to attend. At 10:45 a.m., a bailiff called out, "Case number 247, James Miller." James was led into the courtroom, the chains around his ankles making a soft clinking sound against the polished floor. The room was nearly empty, just a judge, prosecutor, court reporter, bailiff, and a few administrative staff. No one looked up as he entered, all of them focused on papers or computer screens. The courtroom itself was impressive, with high ceilings and wooden benches. American flags flanked the judge's bench. It reminded James of the day he'd been given his Bronze Star, the ceremony with all its formal dignity. That felt like a lifetime. Ego Thomas was already at the defense table, setting down his files. He gave James a quick nod as the bailiff guided him to stand beside his attorney. "Case number 247, Your Honor," the clerk announced. "The State versus James Miller, charges of petty theft and trespassing." Judge Wilson looked up from her papers. She was an older woman with silver-rimmed glasses and gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her face was lined, but her eyes were sharp as she glanced at James, then back to the file in front of her. "How does the defendant plead?" she asked. Thomas nudged James slightly. "Guilty, Your Honor," James said, his voice sounding strange to his own ears. The prosecutor, a young woman with a neat ponytail, stood up. "Your Honor, the state recommends 30 days incarceration. The defendant has a history of vagrancy citations and refused to leave the bakery when asked by the owner." Judge Wilson nodded, then looked at Thomas. "Does the defense have anything to add?" Thomas cleared his throat. "Yes, Your Honor. While my client does admit to taking the bread, I'd like the court to consider that Mr. Miller is a veteran who served 3 tours in Afghanistan. He received a Bronze Star for valor in combat." James glanced at Thomas with surprise. He hadn't mentioned the Bronze Star in their brief conversation. The judge's expression softened slightly. "Is this true, Mr. Miller?" "Yes, Your Honor," James replied, standing a little straighter. "And how long have you been homeless, Mr. Miller?" The direct question caught James off guard. Most people preferred to talk around his situation, using words like transient or between homes. "About 2 years now, Your Honor," the judge made a note on her pad. "And have you sought assistance from the VA?" "I've tried," James said honestly. "The waiting lists are long, and sometimes—" He paused, not wanting to say too much but feeling like this might be his only chance to explain. "Sometimes it's hard to keep appointments when you don't have a place to sleep or a phone." The judge seemed to consider this, tapping her pen against the bench. The courtroom was quiet except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. James could feel sweat forming at the back of his neck despite the cool air. 30 days does seem appropriate given the circumstances, Judge Wilson finally said. "However, I'm willing to consider alternatives if—" The heavy wooden door at the back of the courtroom swung open with a loud creak, cutting off the judge mid-sentence. Everyone turned to look at the interruption. James couldn't see who had entered, but he noticed the bailiff's eyes widen in surprise. The judge peered over her glasses, a flicker of recognition crossing her face. "Well," she said, "this is unexpected." Everyone in the courtroom turned to look at the man walking down the center aisle. He moved with confidence, his steps measured and purposeful. James couldn't place him at first, but there was something familiar about him. The man wore a simple, black jacket over a button-up shirt, jeans, and boots. His hair was short and neat with touches of gray at the temples. As he got closer, James realized why everyone was staring. It was Chuck Norris. The Chuck Norris. The martial arts champion. The movie star. The guy whose face had been on posters and TV screens for decades. The bailiff straightened his uniform, clearly surprised. The prosecutor leaned over to whisper something to her assistant. Even Thomas, James's attorney, seemed to forget about his heavy caseload for a moment. Judge Wilson was the first to speak. "Mr. Norris," she said, her tone carefully neutral but unable to hide a note of surprise. "This is unexpected." Chuck Norris nodded respectfully to the judge. "Your Honor, I apologize for the interruption. I was hoping I might address the court regarding Mr. Miller's case." James blinked in confusion. How did Chuck Norris know his name? Why would someone like him care about a homeless vet stealing bread? It didn't make any sense. The judge seemed just as puzzled. This is highly unusual, Mr. Norris. Court proceedings are public, but we don't typically allow spectators to address the court. I understand, Your Honor, Norris replied, but I believe I have information relevant to this case. There was a long pause as Judge Wilson considered this. Court rules were court rules, but this was Chuck Norris. Finally, she nodded. Given the circumstances, I'll allow it. But keep it brief, please. Thank you, Your Honor. Norris turned slightly so he could address both the judge and James. His eyes met James's for a moment, and James was surprised by the respect he saw there. I don't know James Miller personally, Norris began, his voice steady and clear in the quiet courtroom. I was at the Veteran Support Center downtown this morning for an event. While I was there, I overheard two officers talking about the homeless vet case, about a veteran arrested for stealing bread. Norris reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded newspaper clipping. There was a small mention of it in this morning's paper. It didn't say much, just that a homeless veteran had been arrested for theft at Martinez's bakery. He unfolded the paper carefully. Most people probably skimmed right past this little paragraph, but when I heard the officers mention the same case, something made me ask for more details. James felt uncomfortable being the center of attention. He stared down at his hands, wishing he could disappear. What was happening made no sense to him. The officer mentioned the veteran's name. Norris continued. James Miller. That name sounded familiar to me. I've met thousands of veterans over the years, but something about this name stuck out. He looked directly at James now. So I made a call to a buddy of mine at the VA, asked him to check something for me. Norris turned back to the judge. Your Honor, did you know that James Miller was awarded the Bronze Star for valor in Afghanistan? That he saved 3 fellow Marines during an ambush outside Kandahar? James felt his face grow hot. He didn't talk about that day, not to anyone. How did Chuck Norris know about it? The judge looked down at the file in front of her. His military service was mentioned, but not these specific details. Norris nodded. I thought that might be the case. The citation for his medal says he exposed himself to enemy fire to drag his wounded comrades to safety. He was shot twice in the process, but continued until all 3 men were secure. He paused, letting the words sink in. That's the kind of man standing before you today, Your Honor. The courtroom was completely silent now. James could feel everyone looking at him, seeing him, really seeing him, for the first time in years. With all due respect, Your Honor, the prosecutor interjected. While Mr. Miller's service is commendable, it doesn't change the fact that he broke the law. I'm not suggesting it does, Norris replied calmly. I'm not here to excuse breaking the law. I'm here to ask if justice is really served by locking up a decorated combat veteran for being hungry. The prosecutor frowned, but didn't respond. Norris turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I've worked with veterans for many years. I've seen how difficult the transition to civilian life can be, especially for those who served in combat. PTSD, depression, difficulty holding down jobs, these aren't excuses, they're realities. James felt a lump forming in his throat. It was strange hearing someone else put into words the things he'd struggled with for so long. The Veteran Support Center where I was this morning, Norris continued. They run a rehabilitation program for vets who've fallen on hard times. Housing, counseling, job training, they have an impressive success rate. I spoke with the director before coming here. They have a spot available for Mr. Miller if the court would consider it as an alternative to jail time. Judge Wilson looked thoughtful. And who would guarantee his participation in this program? I would, Your Honor, Norris said without hesitation. I'll personally vouch for Mr. Miller and cover any restitution owed to the bakery owner. Thomas, who had been watching this exchange with growing amazement, finally found his voice. Your Honor, as Mr. Miller's attorney, I would strongly support this alternative. The judge looked at James. Mr. Miller, do you have anything to say for yourself? All eyes were on him now. James swallowed hard, trying to find the right words. He wasn't used to speaking up anymore. On the streets, being invisible was safer. But something about having Chuck Norris stand up for him, A complete stranger who somehow knew about his service made him stand a little straighter. "I'm not proud of where I've ended up, Your Honor," he said, his voice rough but steady. "I didn't plan for my life to go this way, but I never stopped being the Marine who served his country. He paused, searching for the words. "I just lost my way home." The quiet in the courtroom was profound. Even the court reporter had stopped typing for a moment. "And this program?" Judge Wilson asked. "Would you be willing to participate fully?" James nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. I would." The judge studied him for a long moment. "Mr. Miller, I've heard a lot of promises in this courtroom. What makes me think you'll keep yours?" James met her gaze. "Because Marines don't quit, Your Honor. We keep going until the mission is complete. That's what they taught me, and that's what I still believe." For the first time, Judge Wilson's stern expression softened slightly. "Well said, Mr. Miller. Well said." Judge Wilson tapped her pen against her desk, thinking. The courtroom remained silent, waiting for her decision. James could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. After years of things going wrong, could something finally go right? "I need to consider what's best for all parties involved," the judge finally said. She looked at the prosecutor. "Does the bakery owner just want restitution, or is he insistent on pressing charges?" The prosecutor shuffled through her papers. "Mr. Martinez mainly wants to be compensated for the stolen items, Your Honor. He did mention concerns about homeless individuals loitering near his business, but his primary concern was the theft itself." Chuck Norris spoke up. "I'd be happy to speak with Mr. Martinez personally. Perhaps we could work together on a solution that benefits the community." The judge nodded. "That would be helpful." She turned back to James. "Mr. Miller, I want to be clear about something. This court takes theft seriously regardless of the circumstances, however." She paused, studying James carefully. "I also believe in second chances, especially for those who have served our country." James held his breath. Next to him, Thomas had stopped fidgeting with his papers. "Here's what I'm going to do," Judge Wilson continued. "The theft charge will be suspended pending your completion of the Veteran Support Center Rehabilitation Program. You will need to follow all program requirements for 6 months. You will also need to pay restitution to Mr. Martinez, which Mr. Norris has offered to cover." She leaned forward slightly. "If you successfully complete the program and stay out of trouble, the charges will be dismissed. If not, you'll be back in this courtroom facing the original charges plus violation of court orders. Do you understand these terms, Mr. Miller?" "Yes, Your Honor," James said, his voice steadier than he expected. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," the judge replied, though her tone had softened. "The hard work is ahead of you." She looked at Chuck Norris. "Mr. Norris, I'm trusting that you'll follow through on your offer to assist Mr. Miller." Norris nodded. "You have my word, Your Honor." With that, Judge Wilson brought down her gavel. "Case suspended pending completion of rehabilitation program. Next case." Just like that, it was over. The bailiff stepped forward to remove James's handcuffs. The metal cuffs that had felt so heavy a moment ago fell away, leaving his wrists feeling strangely light. Thomas patted James on the shoulder. "That was unexpected," he said, a hint of a smile crossing his tired face. "But good. Very good." He gathered his papers. "I've got another case in 5 minutes. The bailiff will give you release papers. Good luck, Mr. Miller." With that, he was gone, already focused on his next client. James stood there, unsure what to do next. The courtroom was already moving on, the clerk calling the next case number. Chuck Norris approached him, extending his hand. "James," he said simply, "it's an honor to meet you." James took his hand automatically, still trying to process what had happened. "I don't understand," he said quietly as they moved toward the back of the courtroom. "Why did you do this? Why would you help someone you don't even know?" They stepped out into the hallway where the noise of the courthouse, phones ringing, People talking, doors opening and closing, created a wall of sound after the quiet of the courtroom. "Let's find somewhere quieter to talk," Norris suggested, guiding James toward a small waiting area at the end of the hall. Two plastic chairs sat against the wall next to a water fountain. Not exactly private, but at least they could hear each other. "To answer your question," Norris said as they sat down, "I help veterans because I believe we owe them a debt that can never fully be repaid. I was in the Air Force myself, though I never saw combat like you did." James shook his head. "But there are thousands of vets in trouble. Why me?" Norris leaned forward slightly. "When I heard your name, it sounded familiar. I remember reading about what you did in Afghanistan. That kind of courage, running into gunfire to save your friends, that stays with a person." James looked down at his hands. They were rough now, with calluses in different places than when he'd been a Marine. "That was a different life," he said softly. "A different person." "No," Norris said firmly. "Same person, same heart, same courage. You've just lost your way for a while." A silence fell between them. Down the hall, a child was crying. Someone laughed. Life going on as normal while James's world had just turned upside down. "What happens now?" James finally asked. "Now," Norris said, "we get you to the Veteran Support Center. They're expecting us." He checked his watch. "The director's name is Mike. He's a good man, former Navy. You'll like him." James nodded slowly. 6 months in a program, a chance to get back on his feet. It seemed too good to be true. Part of him wanted to run, to retreat back to the familiar streets where at least he knew what to expect. The unknown was scarier sometimes than the hardships he'd grown used to. "I don't have anything," James said. "No clothes except what I was wearing when they arrested me. No ID except my VA card." "We'll figure it out," Norris assured him. "One step at a time." James nodded again, still trying to process everything. "I need to stop by the shelter, let them know I won't need that spot after all. There's a guy there, Pete, who's been waiting even longer than me. Maybe he can take it." Norris looked at him with something like approval. "We can do that. Anything else you need to take care of?" James thought for a moment. "I should probably let the librarian at the downtown branch know I'm okay. She lets me use the computer there, holds books for me sometimes." "We'll stop there too," Norris said. "And we should get you some clothes, toiletries, the basics." James felt uncomfortable at the thought of charity. "I can't pay you back, not right away." Norris waved this off. "Consider it an investment. Pay it forward someday when you're back on your feet." The bailiff appeared then, holding a clipboard. "Miller, your release papers, sign here." He handed James a pen, pointing to the line at the bottom of the form. As James signed his name, he realized his handwriting was shaky. When was the last time he'd written anything besides his name on a shelter sign-in sheet? The bailiff took back the clipboard. "Your personal items are at the processing desk." He nodded to Norris, then walked away. James and Norris made their way to the processing desk, where James received the small plastic bag containing his few possessions. He immediately put his dog tags back around his neck, feeling somehow more like himself with their familiar weight. Outside the courthouse, the day was bright and clear. James squinted in the sunlight. For the first time in years, he felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest. It took him a moment to recognize it. Hope. Small and fragile, but definitely there. "Ready?" Norris asked. James took a deep breath of fresh air. "Ready." 2 years later, James Miller stood before a very different audience. The community room at the Veteran Support Center was packed with people, some in uniform, others in civilian clothes, all watching him with interest. James felt a flutter of nerves in his stomach, but it was the good kind of nervous, the kind that came from doing something that mattered. He looked down at his notes, then back up at the crowd. His blue suit felt a little stiff. He was still more comfortable in jeans and a t-shirt, but today was special. Today marked his official start as a full-time counselor at the center that had changed his life. 2 years ago, James began, his voice steady. "I was arrested for stealing bread. I was hungry, homeless, and had pretty much given up." He paused, letting his gaze move across the room. "I thought my life was over, or at least, any life worth living." In the back row, James spotted Chuck Norris, who gave him an encouraging nod. Chuck visited the center regularly now, but he never made a big deal about it, preferring to let the veterans be the focus of attention. "What I didn't know," James continued, "was that rock bottom would become the foundation for something new." The first 6 months at the center hadn't been easy. James had struggled with the structure, the therapy sessions, the requirement to open up about things he'd kept buried for years. There were days when he'd wanted to walk out, to return to the familiar streets where at least he knew what to expect. The hardest part wasn't getting off the streets, James told the group. It was facing myself, admitting that I needed help, accepting that the war had changed me, and that was okay. The Veteran Support Center program was thorough. Housing came first. A small but private room where James could close the door and feel safe. Then came healthcare, treatment for the physical problems that had gone untreated for years, and therapy for the invisible wounds that had driven him to isolation. "They got me a doctor for my body," James said, "and one for my mind." Both were equally important. After 3 months, James had started job training. He'd worked in the center's kitchen at first, then moved to maintenance. But it was when he started helping with the weekly support groups that he found his calling. "I discovered I had something valuable to offer," he explained to the crowd. "My experience, even the worst parts, could help other vets who were walking the same path." In the front row, Mike, the center's director, smiled. He had been the first to suggest that James might make a good counselor. "You've been where they are," Mike had told him. "That counts for more than any degree." Over the next year, James had taken classes at the community college, earned his peer support specialist certification, and started working part-time with new arrivals at the center. Now at 45, he was starting his first professional job since leaving the Marines. "The program we're launching today," James explained, "is something I'm especially proud of. We're calling it Operation Intercept. The goal is simple: identify veterans in the legal system and connect them with resources before they end up incarcerated or on the streets." The idea had come to James and Chuck during one of their regular coffee meetings. Why wait until veterans hit rock bottom? Why not create a network to catch them earlier? "We've partnered with the county courts, the police department, and the VA," James continued. "When a veteran gets arrested or cited, our team gets notified. We show up, at the jail, at the courthouse, wherever, and we offer alternatives." The 6-month pilot program, they'd already helped 28 veterans find housing, healthcare, and legal assistance. It wasn't always easy, and not everyone accepted help the first time it was offered. But it was making a difference. "And that's not all," James said, feeling a surge of pride. "I'm especially excited to announce our partnership with local businesses." He gestured to a man sitting in the second row. "Mr. Martinez from Martinez's Bakery is one of our first business partners." The baker stood up briefly, acknowledging the applause with a shy wave. The same man who had once called the police on James now hired veterans part-time in his bakery. He also donated all unsold bread to local shelters at the end of each day. "Mr. Martinez and I didn't exactly get off to a great start," James said, with a smile, earning a laugh from the crowd. "But now we're working together to make sure no one has to steal bread to survive in our community." As James continued his presentation, he couldn't help but marvel at the journey that had brought him here. From the battlefield to the streets to this podium, it hadn't been a straight line, but somehow each step had led to this moment. After the formal presentation, people gathered in small groups, enjoying refreshments and conversation. James found himself approached by a young reporter from the local paper. "Your story is really inspiring," she said, notebook in hand. "What do you think made the difference for you? Why did you succeed when so many others don't make it off the streets?" James thought carefully before answering. It would be easy to say it was all his own determination or the program's effectiveness, but the truth was more complicated. "I got lucky," he said finally. "Someone saw me when I was invisible. Someone believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." He glanced across the room where Chuck was chatting with some veterans. The system is designed to process people, not help them. I was just a case number until Chuck Norris walked into that courtroom. The reporter scribbled in her notebook. So you're saying the difference was celebrity intervention? That's hardly a scalable solution. James shook his head. No, that's not what I'm saying. Chuck could have written a check or made a phone call. That would have been easier. What made the difference was that he showed up, in person. He saw me, as a human being with value and potential. He gestured around the room. That's what we're trying to do with Operation Intercept. Show up, see people, treat them with dignity, connect them with resources. It's not complicated, but it takes commitment. Later, as the crowd thinned out, James found himself standing next to Chuck near the refreshment table. Good job today, Chuck said, clapping him on the shoulder. You're a natural public speaker. James laughed. I don't know about that. I was nervous as hell. Couldn't tell, Chuck assured him. You looked like you belonged up there. They fell into a comfortable silence, watching the remaining guests mingle. A group of newer veterans were talking animatedly with some of the program graduates. The sound of genuine laughter filled the room. People always ask me what it was like, James said after a moment, having Chuck Norris come to my rescue. They expect some crazy story about roundhouse kicks or something. Chuck laughed. And what do you tell them? I tell them the truth, James replied, meeting his friend's eyes. That the toughest thing you ever did wasn't in any movie. It was seeing a human being when everyone else saw a case number. Through the windows, James could see a van pulling up outside. The new group of veterans was arriving for intake. Among them would be people like him, lost, scared, perhaps angry at the world. Some would be resistant to help. Others would be desperate for it. All of them deserved a second chance. James straightened his tie. Looks like the new group is here. Ready to change some more lives? Chuck nodded, his expression serious but hopeful. One at a time, James, one at a time.